Hey friend, Chris here from MyLogicProRules.com, the website that helps you get the most you can out of Apple's Logic Pro. Today I want to show you all the different options available to you when you want to quantize both MIDI and audio in your projects. We're going to focus on quantizing MIDI performances and regions just because there are a couple extra quantizing parameters that are only available when you're quantizing MIDI, but of course we'll relate this to audio regions as well. I'll make sure to include text throughout the video that just points out which parameters are available for both MIDI and audio. And we're also going to spend a lot of time in the inspector on the left-hand side here in Logic Pro. Just click on the I button in the control bar to introduce the inspector. And right at the top, we have the region inspector, which is a drop-down tab. And from there, we have Quantize, but there are other advanced parameters as well to fine-tune the results of your quantizing, from Q swing to, if you click on the More tab right here, to Q velocity, Q length, Q-Flam, Q range, and Q strength. Now the region inspector is amazing because it allows you to adjust all sorts of parameters of your regions on a per region basis. Obviously for this video, we're quantizing. So we could select this drum region and quantize it to a particular value while setting this drum region to a different value, regardless of the fact that they live on the same drum track. Or if we back up, we can select multiple regions simultaneously and affect all of them at the same time. So we've now quantized all four regions to an eighth note value. Of course, some folks might be wondering, if you're a little new to this, what is quantizing? What exactly are we talking about? Well, let's solo this drum performance. Let's pop open the piano roll so we can see and hear this performance and how it lands with the metronome when we play it back. If we take a quick look by zooming in, we can see that this drum performance that I tapped out on a MIDI keyboard, that the individual notes don't really line up with each bar and beat line of the grid. You see these lines in the background, and the notes for the most part are a little behind each of these bar and beat lines. Some notes are ahead. And if we take a listen to this performance with the metronome, you may hear that the performance doesn't land exactly with the metronome. Let's take a listen. Okay, so you could probably hear it doesn't land exactly with the metronome each and every time. What quantizing is a procedure of adjusting a performance in terms of its timing, whether it's MIDI or audio, to better land usually with the project, with the metronome, with the grid. Or in other cases, to better land with the timing of other tracks or regions in your project. So maybe the drums sound amazing to us, but we want our piano or our bass to better land with the drums. Again, you don't have to necessarily quantize anything if you don't want to. But sometimes you may run into a performance that, just is a little ahead, a little behind, a little sloppy, and it could be tightened up. And quantizing, this procedure, allows us to very quickly tighten up a performance really with a click of a mouse. So if we direct our mouse back to the Quantize field in the region inspector and click on the off selection, we have all sorts of options to quantize this performance based on a musical value. So we have more straight ahead values such as quarter notes or 16th notes. You can dig into triplets or swing. There's all sorts of options for you to dig into. And for this performance, it's a very simple drum beat. So I'm going to select an eighth note value. Pay attention to where the notes in the piano roll end up moving to when I make this selection. Okay, so we've seen some movement. Let's take a listen to this performance now with the metronome and see how the quantization has done. Okay, so our performance lands exactly with the grid each and every time, and that's what quantization does. But we've maybe perhaps lost some of the humanity in the performance as a result. Some of the snare flams where the left and right hand hit the snare almost at the same time, but not quite. It doesn't even sound like they're flamming anymore. So we may want to fine-tune these results so they sound more human. It's close to being quantized, it's tighter, but it's not, 100% sounding like a robot. And that's where the advanced parameters come into the picture. Before we dig into those, though, let me just point out that these grid lines that you see in the piano roll in the tracks area, you can adjust these. You can adjust the resolution by going to the LCD right here in the control bar. We have the time signature, and then we have the division. And if you click on the division, we have different options to adjust the resolution of the grid. So we can select a quarter note value. So we just see one, line for each quarter note beat in a bar. We can set this as something finer like 32 beats per bar. And if you don't see these options For time signature and division, just hover your mouse in an empty section of the control bar, right click or hold Control and click, select Customize Control Bar and Display, and right here under LCD, I would select Custom, and then we have the option to introduce the time signature and division. From here, the next most obvious option for us to adjust is now Q-Swing. And I say now because Q-Swing previously, when we had this set to off, was not available to us for adjusting. Same with the other advanced parameters. So when you make a selection, a quantized value selection, you then can fine-tune the results from there. So Q-Swing introduces swing to a performance. It starts at 50%, and you can adjust it, anywhere to 1% to 99. Usually you're going to want to spend a lot of time between 50 and 75% for the most natural results. I've adjusted this to 70%. Let's take a listen to what this sounds like. Okay, classic swing feel. And again, you can go in the opposite direction. So who knows what 9% sounds like. That's weird. So let's not do that. From there, we're going to go all the way to the bottom. We're cutting ahead. But probably the next most important, most valuable option when it comes to quantizing for most folks will be Q strength. At this moment, we have 100% quantized each and every note of this drum performance to land exactly at an eighth note value along the grid. But maybe that feels a little too mechanical. So the Q strength option allows you to determine how aggressive Logic should be when it quantizes the individual notes or transients. If we drag down on the Q strength option, we start to see the individual notes of our performance go back to their original position. So if we set this all the way down to 0%, each and every note is returned to its original recorded position. So in this case, you could adjust. You could say, hey, I want this performance to be quantized. I want it to be as close to where it should land along the grid as possible, but I want it to retain some humanity and not be hard quantized. At an 80% value, that's pretty close. It's almost fully quantized, but we're leaving some variation in the performance. Okay, we still don't have that flamming effect quite yet, but you can play with this and, just see how hard you want to quantize certain parts of your projects. All right, let's now make our way to the top of the advanced parameters, and we have Q velocity to start with. If we examine our bass performance right here, and pop open the piano roll, we want to make sure to select this bass region and set the quantization value, again, to a value that makes sense. So an eighth note value. Let's take a listen. As you can see and hear, certain notes are louder than others based on the velocity of each of these notes. So the ones closer to red are louder. The ones, that are green and closer to blue and purple are quieter. Q velocity is a parameter that allows you to quantize the velocities of the individual notes. So basically, as you drag up on this value, Logic is going to try to figure out what the average velocity is across all these different notes and try to bring them closer together so that they're performed at more or less equal velocity. So at 90%, just about every note is played pretty close to one another now in terms of its velocity. Let's take a listen. Cool. If you go in the opposite direction, so we're heading below 0% into negative values, Logic, instead of trying to bring all the notes closer together in terms of their velocity, it's increasing the discrepancy, the differences between them. So the louder notes are even louder now, the quieter notes are quieter. And if we drag down even further, we're just making things even more disparate, separate from one another, and dynamic. Cool. Now Q length, let's pop over to just these two notes that I plugged into a track. Q length is similar. It allows you to quantize the length of notes so that they are closer together in terms of their length or further apart. To illustrate, we got to again select a quantized value and then the Q length. Notice that this note is a lot longer than this note. If we start to drag up on Q length, we see that this note is getting shorter to get closer to the length of this note, while the second note is getting longer, not by much, but getting longer to get closer to the size and length of this note. Whereas again, if you pull it in a negative direction, you're just increasing the differences between them. Now, Q-Flam is a really awesome control that would really help out with our drum performance. But instead, I'm going to focus on this piano performance. Now, this piano performance is performed in such a way, if you take a look, the notes don't land on the bar or beat at all, and they don't land together at all. And that's intended because they're kind of rolling through. So let's take a listen to each of these chords. Now, if we set a quantize value to an eighth note, now every chord and every note in the chord is landing exactly at the same time. We've completely eliminated this rolling effect. And that's clearly not the intention of this performance. That's where Q-Flam comes into the picture. Q-Flam allows us to reintroduce that flamming or rolling effect to our performance. So we could see that our chord has been quantized to those eighth note values. But obviously the notes that were further behind in relation to the first note are now moving back to being further behind. So we're reintroducing that rolling effect, and you can go, as far as you want. If you're working in positive values, you're introducing this upward arpeggiation. Let's take a listen. Whereas if you work in a negative value, you introduce a downward arpeggiation. Now we have the most confusing option of all when it comes to quantizing, and that is the Q range parameter. Let's dig into this electric piano region just because I think this is going to be the clearest illustration of Q range. But if you take note, we have these individual notes right by the bar 2 line. One note is ahead, some notes are behind, some are really far behind. If we set a quantized value for this region, set it to eighth note, we can see that every single note has now been quantized exactly the same. Again, maybe not desirable. Q range allows you to tell Logic basically, hey, these notes quantize, these notes don't quantize. And it's all based on how close each of these notes are to the bar beat value that you're trying to quantize to. So in this case, just take a look at how these notes are all lined up. And if we turn this off, remember where they were in relation to that particular bar. If we start to push the Q range in the positive direction, so we can see we have different values, or you can just, drag up or down on the Q range. If we set this to maybe like a 30-second note value, check it out. Okay, so some notes have been quantized, most of them, some have not. Let's kind of work our way backwards. So we'll start at 16th, 4th note. Let's go even further. So maybe 96th. Okay. 192nd. Okay, so some notes are getting quantized, some are not. What's the deal? When you're working in positive values of Q range, you're basically saying, hey, Logic, any notes that fall within, in this case, 192nd of a beat to the value I'm trying to quantize to, those notes should be quantized. Anything that's further out than 192nd of a beat, don't quantize them. So in this case, if we adjust the resolution of our grid, I don't even know if it'll show us 192 beats. Yeah, it's a little too fine. But if we, work with as fine as we can and we set this to off, we can see that that note is pretty dang close to the bar line. So we set this back. That note has been quantized, but these notes are further than 192nd of a beat. So they are untouched. They're not quantized. And as we work our way up, 96th of a beat, this note has been quantized now, while these other two are too far to be quantized. And we keep going up, so maybe a 48th of a beat. Okay, that note is close enough. So if we now set this to a 48th division and we set this to off, we can see that that note falls within a 48th note or beat of that grid value. So we set this back to on. Now all three of these notes have been quantized. Let's bring in this guy right over here. So let's adjust the division value. Let's see, 24th, nope, 16th. There it is. So it falls within a 16th note of that grid value. So let's go over here, select 16th note. And Now it has been quantized, right? So in a positive direction, we're basically telling Logic, hey, Logic, only tighten up or quantize the notes that are closest to where they should be landing anyways, which kind of doesn't make sense. Really, you want to quantize the stuff that's the furthest out, the stuff that's way late or way too early. And that's why you probably want to work in the negative direction. So if we go back to 0 ticks, everything is quantized because we made no adjustment to Q range. We start working in the other direction. Okay, now we've told Logic, hey Logic, anything that falls within this value, don't quantize it. It's too close to where it's supposed to land anyways. It's well performed already. We don't need to quantize it. And we start working our way in the opposite direction. Okay, these two notes, we're already close to the mark. We're not bothering with quantizing them. And we keep working our way down. Look at that, 48th note. And then when we get to the 16th note value, okay, this note falls within a 16th note of that division. So we're telling Logic, hey, don't even bother quantizing it, which that's the furthest note out. That's the note that probably needs the quantizing. So if we set this back to 24th beat, okay, now the note that needed the most help has been quantized and everything else has been left alone. Okay, so we have dug through so much in this video, but there's two other options I want to point out to you because they're really special options within the context of quantizing. And that is, to start with, smart quantizing. So again, if we pop open our piano performance and we once again quantize this performance to an 8th note value, look at that. Everything's been quantized in a very unnatural way and it doesn't fit this performance. Now we could play with Q-Flam to reintroduce that flamming effect and that could work really well. Or we could set right here, quantize, instead of quantizing, just classic quantize, which is what we've been working with. We click on quantize and we have the option to smart quantize. And look at that. Now we see that our rolling chords are now remained intact. And it doesn't even look like that these chords necessarily land exactly on the 8th note value. But in fact, Logic in smart quantize mode is weighing the proximity of each of these notes and the performance as a whole in relation to this grid value. And it's adjusting this performance based on this proximity, or what it calls center of gravity. It maintains the humanity in the performance while quantizing it at the same time. So if we set this back to off, we see that there's movement, and we set this back to an 8th note. Oh, everything has been moved while retaining the natural performance. So if we bring in the piano with the bass, with the drums, take a listen. Sounds great, versus which is amazing. And on top of that, when you select a value using Smart Quantize, there is this new option called Q Anti-Flam. So instead of preserving the flamming or rolling of these chords, we can introduce less flamming of these chords or performances. And lastly, we have groove templates. Groove templates are awesome because up until now, we've been quantizing each of our performances to land with the grid or the metronome of the project. And sometimes that can sound kind of mechanical and inhuman. Instead, maybe you prefer, in this example, the drums, really prefer the timing of the drums, and you just want the bass and the piano to land tighter with the drums, not necessarily the grid. Well, you can do that using groove templates. So if we select our drum regions, we'll select one. If we go to the Quantize dropdown, we have this option at the bottom called Make Groove Template. When we select this, Logic will analyze the transients of an audio region or the notes of a MIDI performance, and then it will create a custom groove template, a custom quantized value based on that performance. So if we go right down here, it's named Instrument 1, just because the region is named Instrument 1, but it's the drum performance. So if we now select our piano performance, and let's pop open the piano roll, go to the Quantize dropdown and select our drum quantize groove map. Okay, we've seen some adjustments. And then if we go to the bass performance and do the same thing, so let's zoom in and select the drum groove template. We've seen some adjustments. Let's take a listen. Of course, we're losing some of that flam action with the piano. So let's just make sure to select that piano region and then drag up that Q-Flamming. And now our bass and our piano are landing better with the drums. Your mileage may vary. It all depends on, how different the performances are between tracks. If something is completely different from another track, you might not get the groove template you're after. But groove template is an awesome addition to adjusting the timing of performances to better land with other performances. So that was a lot of information, but I really wanted to provide you with just about everything you need to know when it comes to quantizing in Logic Pro. If this video has been helpful for you, as always, I highly recommend subscribing to the channel, Why Logic Pro Rules, or subscribing on the website itself, whylogicprorules.com. Every week I'm posting new videos, emails, and posts to help you get the most you can out of Apple's Logic Pro. Thanks so much.